Hi, everyone, and welcome to Sedscast. It's your host, Owen Marr. Joining me as co-host is Chad Cerutti. Our guest today is Shaun D'Mello, who is the Vice President of Launch at Rocket Lab. Shaun, how you doing today?
Very good, thanks, and thanks for having me on board. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, we are too. We were just talking before we started recording. This is the first time where the guest is on a different day. So Shaun's coming from New Zealand, and for him it is March 10th, but for us it's March 9th. And so
Oh, you just
it's
dated the podcast. What are you
Yeah, it's all
doing?
right. It's coming out in a couple weeks, but hopefully people don't notice. Yeah, this is about a week after Rocket Lab announced that they're going public through SPAC and Neutron. So we'll talk about all that stuff and also talk a lot about Shaun's current position and all the stuff going on with Electron, which is very exciting. So I guess to get into it, Shaun, can you start by just giving us some background on who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I've basically from Australia and joined Rocket Lab about 7 years ago now. My role is the Vice President of Launch. I ultimately responsible for delivering our global launch capability, and that is really delivering safe, frequent, and reliable launch. What that looks like on a day-to-day basis, really directing the end-to-end execution of our launch ops and mission ops, development and operation of our launch sites across the globe, and then also working through our safety assurance, licensing, and regulatory compliance programs. Again, ultimately to make sure that electrons leave the pad on time and go exactly where they're destined for.
Yeah, and you've done a good job of that to date. I think that's one thing that stands out from Rocket Lab is the reliability right from the get-go. So before we talk about Electron and Rocket Lab, I think one other question we usually like to ask is what got you interested in space in the first place? Was it something where you knew you always wanted to go into space, or is that kind of a passion that came around over time?
Yeah, great question. I'd probably say it's a combination of both. I've been obsessed with things that fly from a very young age. But again, fundamentally, it's really hard to not be drawn towards things that travel fast and make a lot of noise. And the launch industry, I think, encapsulates that in many ways. Um, and the other aspect, I think, of space and the launch business as a whole is just the challenge. It's a significant engineering challenge where you've got to pack a whole lot of energy into systems with often very conflicting, contradicting requirements that ultimately delivers this very fragile object perfectly into orbit. And that in itself is, I think, I find quite fascinating. And just always working with a very tight margin between success and failure, and being on the right side of that success and failure curve is also incredibly gratifying. So that's what got me into space. It's just overall the challenge. It's a very, very interesting thing to solve.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I always love talking about space with people and hearing like how they got into it because there's always like a couple different answers people have, but it's always just space is awesome and like it's great. And there's so many cool things that people are doing and it's exciting. Yeah, I love it. How did you get involved with Rocket Lab specifically?
Yeah, I reached out in the early days. This was before the Electron program was actually made public or brought
Hmm.
out to the world. Um, Being from Australia, I graduated, was working an early job there for a few months, and I heard of Rocket Lab through conferences at the time. Back then, we or Rocket Lab back then were just focused on sounding rockets, and that's what I thought might be the opportunity. Little did I know that we were chasing more of an orbital venture very
Hmm.
quickly after. Um, but yeah, the interest there was in the region, and in the specific region here. There's not many opportunities in space. It's now growing with the various capabilities, both coming out of Australia and New Zealand. But at the time, the opportunities were scarce, and Rocket Lab was the only, I guess, shop around that was doing interesting work that caught my attention. And I just reached out, and things kind of escalated from there.
That's awesome. I've always wondered about that. So Australia and New Zealand aren't some like it's not an area with a huge history of space launch, and then Electron was like able to become very, very successful from New Zealand. What, from a political sense or just from a cultural sense, allowed like that area of the world to become such a hub for Rocket Lab?
Yeah, good question. And it's one that I also try and figure out and wonder what was the secret sauce that made this all work. But Rocket Lab itself, founded by Peter Beck and Pete's got an incredible history of engineering and coming up with very ingenious solutions. So there's just heritage of innovation and getting things done here that I think came to fruition with a vehicle like Electron, with some of the early design and research and development. So I think putting the history and legacy aside, which, like you pointed out, there isn't a rich history of launch vehicles coming out of New Zealand specifically. Australia has had some in the past. There's just really rich ingenuity here, and there's creativity, and there's a lot of sort of free thinking and the ability to get stuff done very quickly. And I think if you put all those things together, building a rocket becomes possible and achievable, and now proven.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, Electron really just like keeps pushing and pushing the bounds, like starting off with like electrically fed turbo pumps and like other things in the rocket. And then now you've started trying to go into the reusability for Electron, which there's a whole history behind Rocket Lab and reusability. You can look it up. Peter Beck had to eat his hat over it and whatnot. But why did Electron, like, what kind of prompted that change in the first place? And what benefits are there for Electron going reusable?
Yeah, I think, as you said, we've been quoted in the past for not, or at least going away from reusability. But what it really came down to, along our journey of trying to scale Electron as a product from a launch frequency standpoint, was that reusability was a path to actually having more vehicles in the fleet to then launch more frequently. Um, and obviously, there are some cost savings that come with it, which is great. But the biggest thing was to enable higher launch frequency. And instead of having to throw away the stage every single time, being able to bring that back, top up the batteries again and fly is the goal here. And that instantly, again, doubles or triples our cadence from a production and manufacturability standpoint. So that's what became quite an attractive prospect when we realized that that was a potential outcome. And then the R&D that's gone into it, and the recent success we've had with the recovering stage in November last year, has almost proven that point a little further, in the fact that we got hardware back in really good condition in some cases. And that, again, now all of a sudden we've got two vehicles sitting there instead of one. And if we can expand on that, it might be two or three or multiple times of use, which again assists with increasing our launch frequency. So that's really why one of the key reasons we're chasing reusability is just being able to up the frequency, and then our users and our customers eventually will benefit from costs coming down as a function of that.
Sure. And
Yeah.
I also realized for some of our listeners who might not know, Sean, can you explain how Rocket Lab is trying to reuse the rocket? Because it's different from what SpaceX and Falcon 9 do.
Yeah, that's right. I think one of the key differences here is we're relying on technologies like chutes and decelerators on the way back down to slow Electron down. And I think maybe where it's most unique is that Electron's a size that we can actually pick up with an airborne asset like a helicopter. So we don't have to deal with the stage coming back down and splashing onto the ocean, or neither do we have to necessarily have a propulsive reentry and landing. So the current evolution of our thinking and our operations have led us to look at mid-air capture. And again, this is a strong function of its size. It's not a very big launch vehicle that using something like a helicopter pushes out of the performance envelope. We can just about catch it. So it offers us some more creative and unique solutions that could otherwise not be realized with much bigger systems.
Yeah. So when I first heard of the helicopter idea, I was skeptical. I'm guessing whoever first pitched it probably had a mixed response, but it is interesting that you have an open enough mindset that you're able to actually look at it and pull it off. Do you remember like how it first came to be an idea and like the first feasibility study? Like how did you figure out that this might work?
I mean, it definitely helps that Peter is quite obsessed with helicopters. So I can say a lot of that stems back to his thinking about the problem and trying to solve it. But there were many things considered. We considered quite a few options as wide as even landing this into the ocean and then it self-propelling its way back across the ocean to mainland of New Zealand. So nothing was off the table, and nothing is ever off the table when we start new projects here. And that kind of goes back to the creativity and the free thinking that goes into a lot of our solutions that we put forward. Um, And yeah, that's maybe the genesis of how we started, was that nothing was off the table. And when we looked at what a helicopter could do in terms of salvaging the stage one, it looked like a solution that could close and one that was worth pursuing.
Can you walk us through? You started launching in New Zealand. Why you're expanding Electron's base of operations and what that's going to look like in the coming years?
Yeah, sure. If I might just get that question again, Owen, it was why we're launching from New Zealand, or
Like
what?
you
What
started
was
in
the
New
question?
Zealand. Why are you expanding the base of
Sure,
operations, and what's the strategy behind having multiple spaceports?
got it. Yeah, so we started launching in New Zealand, mainly because New Zealand's got an unmatched capability for availability and also access to a number of orbits. To give you, a sense of scale, what we can get from our launch site in Mahia, Launch Complex One, is effectively combining the capability from Cape Canaveral and Vandenberg. So the East Coast and West Coast of the United States you can get from one site because you can fly south and fly east. So largely speaking, geography is a big um, influence as to why we ended up in New Zealand. The other aspects of being here as well, we've got low marine traffic, low air traffic. So when we do have to shut down certain parts of the airspace, which is quite small, we have long durations of time that we effectively affect next to no one around the areas that we're at. And we're in close coordination with our local communities around Mahia as well to make sure our impacts are as minimal as possible. So we find ourselves in a position at Launch Complex One where not only do we run the range, so we have our own schedules that we follow. We pick our own T0s. There's no one else we're coordinating with. It's kind of like having your own private airstrip, right? You're not checking in with air traffic control every now and then for when you can get permission to take off and coordinate with other carriers, so to speak. So the ultimate flexibility is something we need. It's something we need to deliver high frequency launch. And that's really how Launch Complex One was selected. It met all the criteria for delivering high frequency launch, doing things on our own terms, and doing things quickly. Um, and that's where we started. Launch Complex One will continue to be our high frequency launch site. It is a place that was built for volume and getting volume to orbit. We have since expanded. We have a launch site in the United States on the Eastern Shore at Wallops Flight Facility, and that's really tailored for more U.S. government type missions, higher security classifications, where you've got payloads that need to stay in country, for example. Um, that's that's what Launch Complex 2 is tailored for. It's got high secure um, facilities on site that we can leverage. It's got a lot of fueling capabilities for more advanced spacecraft that we can leverage to as part of the NASA Wallops Flight Facility. So that's where Launch Complex 2 sits and its importance and significance in the broader scope of things. And between the two sites, we have an offering to the market that kind of ticks all the boxes, which is why we've sort of diversified beyond launching just from Mahia or New Zealand for that matter.
Yeah. Is there any talk about other space companies going to New Zealand and setting up like a launch complex over there? Because it does seem like there's a lot of extremely enticing benefits, especially for like some of the larger space companies that will be able to actually meet that increased like flexibility and probably or increased frequency of launch rather.
Yeah, it's a great question, and look, we hear of interest all the time. I think one of the key things is we as in Rocket Lab have pretty significant facilities already established here. So any other company wanting to come will need to think about this logistics of moving your launch vehicle that's assembled in the United States or wherever in the world to be bought to New Zealand. So there are some challenges there that need to be addressed. And then with larger launch vehicles too, you ideally would be integrating and manufacturing these vehicles close to your launch site. So for a lot of the larger companies that are established across the globe, one thing they're going to have to figure out is bringing a vehicle that size and that magnitude over as well, which will have its own challenges. But yeah, there's interest, I think, but we've not seen anything really come to fruition on that front.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that makes sense because you are in like that kind of unique niche, well, not niche, but like position where you have like a smaller reusable vehicle and have the facilities and the flexibility to kind of set it up there. Cool.
This is probably a question you get too often, but Rocket Lab is basically like the only VC funded company to actually make it to orbit regularly, aside from the position in terms of physical location. What do you think it is that sets Rocket Lab apart from all these other? There's 100 and something launch companies reported.
Yeah.
What makes you guys different? Why, especially at the start, were you able to get to launch so quickly?
Yeah, great question. And it's maybe getting more and more relevant as we see more and more players come into the industry, and more players look at also expanding and also going public and so on. But I think essentially we've always delivered on what we say we would deliver. We said we were going to solve small launch, and we've done it. We stood up a full satellite division. We've got spacecraft in orbit right now as we speak. So I think our track record really kind of speaks for itself. I don't know if I need to say much more. We've just got a proven track record, and that should build confidence in everything we do in the future as well, and the fact that we will go deliver what we say we will plan on delivering.
Yeah, and I mean that's like VCs see it and like the general public sees it too. I mean, it always feels like it's when you're talking about space companies, there's kind of like the lesser known startups that are trying to get there, and then it is Rocket Lab and SpaceX. And SpaceX gets a lot of like the main public attention, but specifically within the space realm, it's like your company and SpaceX are the two regularly going to orbit as like primary space companies that have like proven that they can do it time and time again and are getting more creative and more flexible and like actually reducing that cost to orbit and everything. So it's no surprise why Rocket Lab is like so well funded by VCs because like even to the general public, it's pretty obvious to see how you guys have set yourself apart from the rest of the group.
Yeah, I saw that comparison in the investor pitch deck, which came out kind of with that announcement. Which, by the way, is one of my, I think, yeah, definitely my favorite slide deck of this year since we're early in the year. But it was a really great summary of the company and how the SPAC stuff's going to work. So I thought that was really cool. And yeah, it's you and SpaceX that do it regularly. One of the slides on that was about future missions to other planets, and it had Moon, which is coming up with Capstone, and then it had Venus and Mars on there. So I'm curious to hear if that's kind of something within the realm of what you're doing since it's launch, and kind of what you're looking to do with the Venus and Mars launches.
Yeah, good questions. Yeah, I mean, right now our organization's focused on getting Capstone, the mission for NASA, delivered. There's a lot of new technology that we're pretty excited about developing there, and a lot of that, is really surreal to see. Sometimes you're walking around the shop floor and you see hardware that's destined for the moon, which is yeah, quite a moment. But we have a lot of focus on that right now. And what that technology development program is creating is a lot of technology that we would then use for other interplanetary missions. So we are working on missions out to Mars and also missions to Venus in the coming years. Again, leveraging a lot of these building blocks that we are creating right now to get to the moon and getting to a lunar orbit. So that's sort of the path there is that we've the critical technologies are already going to be developed. We'll have all those critical technologies this year, and then as we look beyond LEO and look at more interplanetary applications, we would have that technology demonstrated. So we'd be going into those bigger, more ambitious missions with some pedigree already behind us. And as we're trying to get to the moon too, we're learning a lot. The team's learning a whole bunch, and that is great to be doing now and this early. So that once we go in and look for more beyond LEO applications and missions, we'd be coming in with some pedigree and heritage at that point.
Yeah. But so speaking of going beyond Leo and going to other planets, I'm assuming Neutron is that rocket that you're planning to use that for. Can you go for the listeners who might not have heard what Neutron is? You can Google it, but can you give us like a
Yeah.
quick overview of what Rocket Lab is trying to do with Neutron, their new rocket?
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, I guess in a summary, Neutron is the next new big shiny thing, right? Quite literally in some senses. But it is a larger launch vehicle that we will be developing, which we've already started across the business. It is sort of targeting about 8 tons to low Earth orbit, and initial flight plans are from our Walt sites. Um, and it's really there to be a mega constellation builder. So it's there to lift the next set of constellations that we're seeing sort of come online in the 2024, 25, and beyond timeframe, whether it's for commercial industry or the government. So that's what Neutron is being designed, developed for. Right out of the gate, we're looking at reusability. We're seeing this as a fleet type operation where we can reuse the vehicle multiple times. Again, for the same reasons of bringing costs down, but also again providing a high cadence or a highly reliable ride to orbit. And in terms of beyond LEO applications, yeah, I mean, Neutron's a great candidate as well. There are so many things we can do with Electron right now. Capstone's a great example for what you can do with a small rocket to put small payloads, but Neutron just opens up that capability even further to take much bigger assets, much bigger satellites and probes and so on to distant planets. So it feels like a natural evolution from where we started to where we're going. And yeah, we're quite excited to bring Neutron out to market.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask about, because we talked about the electric pumps earlier, and that's something you chose kind of based on the Electron scale. How much of what you've done with Electron do you think will be scalable to Neutron? Because something like electric pumps may or may not be revisited, but other stuff
Mm.
might be pretty easily transferable. So, like, if you had to give percentages, like, what percent can be kind of scaled up from Electron versus what has to be sort of redesigned from the ground up?
Yeah, good question. I feel like maybe we're a bit too early to talk in metrics or percentages,
Hmm.
but what I can say is something scale really well with size. In fact, they don't scale at all. So, for example, a flight computer sitting on Electron will take a certain footprint, and that footprint does not need to be any bigger because it's a bigger rocket. Your GPS units, for example, take the same amount of room in a big rocket as it does on Electron. There might be some slightly small units, or there might be some miniaturization, but some electronics and avionics don't actually scale with the size of the vehicle. The software takes the same amount of room on the chip as it is for a bigger vehicle and a small vehicle. The same amount of controls and interfaces for some of the things like avionics. So avionics are a great example of things that don't actually scale with the size of the
Sure.
vehicle as much. Whereas your engines are a very obvious one, much bigger thrust output, therefore much bigger turbo machinery and so on to support. So there'll be some technologies that will need to be scaling quite significantly and invest a lot of development time into, whereas some we can just take across from Electron. And the biggest thing I think we take from Electron across is the experience of building something that needs to go to orbit. Um, in many ways, when you look at something like an Electron or a much bigger vehicle like a Falcon 9, even you're sort of solving the same kind of problems. You need to move liquid oxygen into a tank. You need to figure out all the systems. The number of valves in many cases are identical. It's just much bigger or much smaller. So macroscopically, getting to orbit, there'll be a lot of problems that we'll run into that we can leverage experience from Electron. But there'll be a whole bunch of new things that will come with the scale of this vehicle and this venture that we would need to sort of approach from scratch, building on the experience from Electron. But the having a team that's made it to orbit in record time is, I think, the biggest asset we've got here. And using that same team to then take Neutron from what it is as an idea right now to realization is our biggest, I think, strategic win, if anything.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that
I
makes
mean,
a lot
when
of
yeah, in the VC world, it's always like the thing you hear time and time again is like you don't invest in a company for its idea. You invest in it for the people because the people are going to be the ones to take that idea into orbit. So yeah,
Yeah, it's a great point.
yeah, definitely makes sense. Specifically for Neutron, I know, or at least like online, there's been a lot of questions around the engines
Mm-hmm.
that are going to be on Neutron because the Rutherford engines that are on Electron won't be able to scale like in the same way. Has any work kind of been laid out or like any progress been made for that so far that you can talk about?
Yeah, good question. I mean, all I can say at this point is we're just trading all options at the moment, and yeah, we're kind of going in with nothing really off the table at this point. So we're just exploring. Bit early to say how we'll land with the technology, but yeah, we're exploring all options, and it's heavily in trade.
Sure. Is that something you're looking to do in house at least, or are you even open to like buying other commercially available engines and such?
Trading everything. We're trading
Okay,
in-house development programs through to what's available in the market. It is a
cool.
very niche product to try and procure a rocket engine period. But we'll have to, yeah, let the trade studies roll out and look at our sizing, and that'll hopefully get us to a solution in short order.
Cool.
Yeah. Based on what you were able to come up with the helicopter idea, I'm sure they'll be able to scale the rocket. So I should have tossed you a softball early, which was kind of about the advantage of small launch. And I think most of our listeners kind of understand the value proposition for small launch versus rideshare. And you've kind of dominated the small launch market. And so I think my initial skepticism with Neutron was why you're trying to push into a market that already has sort of an existing competitor in SpaceX. What is the rationale there, and do you think it's just that there's so much going on in the future that there's enough space for two, or do you think you have like certain competitive advantages in the same way that Electron did over Falcon 9 for certain use cases?
Yeah, sure. So I guess in the context of Neutron, we're seeing a good volume overall that could feed 2 or 3 players at least. And then a lot of these assets that need to go up may also be in direct competition with products like Starlink and so on. So there might be use cases and customers that would want to see their assets go up as quickly as possible. Without having to wait for a rideshare. Look at a mega constellation builder that's dedicated to taking many satellites up there at the same time. And the other thing that differentiates Neutron from Electron is, Electron's got a small lift capability that's tailored for the smaller satellites and constellations that are built from smaller satellites. When we start looking at bigger sizes, it's kind of like an economies of scale that we're just trying to target constellations now that have satellites probably 500, 600 kilograms per satellite. And if they all need to go to the same plane, then something in the order of 8 tons is about a good size is what we've concluded. 5 to 8 tons in the medium class, so to speak, at a given time. A vehicle much bigger would then be flying under capacity. So there'd be a lot of lost revenue that's not realized at a given time either. So the medium class is where we're seeing somewhat of an optimal sizing right now with the future mega constellations that are needing to be built. So it's almost like what Electron is doing right now for smaller constellations with smaller satellites, just sort of that, but at a slightly bigger scale, just because the assets are also slightly bigger.
Okay, so you see it as like what Electron did for kind of the CubeSat, like all these CubeSats are going to Leo. It's the same thing, but now that the satellites are on the order of 50 kilograms or a couple hundred kilograms, it's scaling for that same idea.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Chad, do you want to talk a little bit about like your SPAC questions that I probably don't understand and maybe
I would love to. How much can you answer? Or I'll just go and
Not a
ask
whole
him if you
much.
can't.
Yeah,
Yeah,
not a whole much more, but I mean, mind you far away, and we'll see what
yeah,
I can
sure.
answer.
So, for anyone who doesn't know, Rocket Lab is going public. There will be a publicly traded company on the Nasdaq, I think, officially for anyone who cares. But so, what were some of the main drivers behind Rocket Lab wanting to go public?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones is it's a means of being able to scale at a much higher rate than we have to date with just purely VC funded efforts so far. Um, and I think you would have heard Peter also being quoted out, but it essentially gives us a public currency. It's a currency that's much higher that we can do a lot more with, like strategic acquisitions, and then also we've talked about Neutron a lot, but develop something as big as Neutron is made possible with the funds that we see going through this route. Than anything else. So it's really to do a whole lot more in the time we have, and also being able to accelerate our growth is what this route to go public is giving us.
Cool. And I know, like, as a publicly traded company, then you have like the public as investors, and they sometimes have differing ideas of what a company should be doing than what necessarily Rocket Lab does and what their kind of internal company culture is. Do you anticipate there being any kind of roadblocks or issues or like needing a change within Rocket Lab to be a public company? Like you might not be able to do as many innovative things or be able to take less risks or like anything kind of along that line?
Yeah, it's a fair question to ask, and I think I guess that's the that's sort of what comes with going public. But I don't see any reason or any risks or threats on that regard for the way we do business. Ultimately, our investors are investing in us and will be investing in us to keep doing what we're doing, which is delivering the technology that we do and enabling access to space and doing a whole bunch more in space. So with that sort of mandate, I don't see a whole lot of that really changing between what we do now and what we will be doing. Just that we'll have a whole more investment behind us to get stuff done.
Sure, yeah, and even like I mentioned earlier, like there is very strong public opinion of Rocket Lab and very high hold you guys in like a very high regard. So that definitely makes sense on our side. But I just wanted to hear you confirm that too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Virgin Galactic did a good job of illustrating the public demand for space companies for sure. Um, so one thing I wanted to ask about was well, actually, I'll let Chad ask. Chad, why don't you ask the naming question first? Because I think that's a really good one.
Yes. Who comes up with the names for the Rocket Lab launches? Because they're entertaining. Like they're always so funny. Like some of my favorites. So there's like another one leaves the crust was the name of a mission. It's
Yep.
like Pixar it didn't happen. Other ones. Who comes up with that?
Good question. So we actually run an internal poll, and we have a very talented comms team that do what they do best. But it's a mixture. We have input from our customers. If you're dedicated, if you buy a dedicated launch vehicle, you do have some rights in sort of naming what the mission
Hmm.
is. So it's a mixture of that, and it's a mixture of our staff as well. We run some internal polls to get names for missions, and sort of the best one wins. But doesn't seem like we're running out of any good ones. They keep getting better.
No,
Yeah,
definitely. So is it a requirement for Rocket Lab employees to have a decent sense of humor so that you can keep naming the rocket launch as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's how I learned my job. But bad jokes. But I think it just puts an edge, or at least it's nice to have fun with some things. It does not. All these names don't have to be ultra serious in a very ultra serious business. So
Mhm.
yeah, it just adds a bit of a light touch to what we're doing, and might as well have fun with it while you can.
Definitely.
sure. So one more kind of Rocket Lab related question, and then we'll do a couple on advice. Well, Chad, you can add one more, and if you want. But my kind of last one was, what are you looking forward to for your position moving forward? Like, what has you excited for like the future of your work?
Yeah, I think for me, Neutron's taken a pretty key role, specifically in seeing that come to fruition and doing something again from clean sheet. It for me takes me back to how we developed Electron, where again
Right.
nothing was off bounds or off limits, and could really look at building a product from scratch. So that's quite exciting. It's going to take an enormous effort. Um, and it's going to be incredibly challenging. But I expect that we'll get onto the flip side and look back and be proud of what we achieved. So that's definitely getting a lot of my interest, and also as we sort of venture out with Electron right now to our interplanetary missions. There's a lot there that we're doing that's just new. It's beyond what we've been doing to date. So just constantly pushing the boundaries really is what keeps me interested, and gives me an opportunity to keep learning as well. And as long as that doesn't stop, I'm pretty good.
Sweet. And so, Chad, do you have anything else Rocket Lab before we do advice?
No, go for it. I'd love to hear the advice.
Okay. So yeah, we do a couple advice questions since it's a lot of young people interested in space. One of the first ones is just things you wish you had known. So, as either an engineering student in college, university, or just coming onto the job, what are some just fundamental things you wish you had known earlier, or some lessons you learned that would have been nice to know when you were a little younger?
Yeah, got to think about this one, but I think if I had to look back at university and getting out of school, what was that like? I think for me, if I probably wouldn't have, didn't really need to sweat the small stuff. I think is the biggest thing I'd probably pass on. I'd also say that I wish I'd realized earlier that some of the practical real world experience, which kind of makes sense now, trumps any GPA or grade. Probably the worst thing to say to a number of academics, but um, I, prioritizing and making sure that you go out there and get real world experience, solve real problems, is really what what ideally should be the focus, and not really look into your GPAs and grades. They're just numbers at the end of the day, and really will never define. It's not a really meaningful metric for success, in my view, anyway. I think getting out there and doing it really is. So that's one thing I maybe pass on, or I would tell myself as I was trying to get through university and school.
Yeah, that's surprisingly common, and I keep waiting for our lawsuit from someone that, like, dropped out of school because all they hear is all these leaders from the space industry say, "Don't worry, focus on your projects."
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely
stay in
important.
school, and I
Yeah,
think stay in school. And I think the big thing is a lot of what degrees, I guess, maybe taught me was the ability to teach myself. Is the ability to learn new things, not so much what you
wrangle.
actually learn. A lot of it gets outdated very quickly too, so you got to get comfortable with that. But I think the big takeaway is figure out the art of learning and keep doing that.
Yeah,
Sweet.
that's great.
Chad, you wanna ask one as well?
Yeah, sure.
I think.
So specifically for the space industry and like getting into kind of the launch vehicle companies and some of the other budding space industries, do you have any recommendations for something they might like be looking at or like something they should be trying to do to help get them into these companies?
Yeah, sure. I think maybe ties back to getting that hands-on experience. Um, I think getting the experience with challenging, complex engineering problems is really key. It does not have to be in space, and sometimes you should be trading an opportunity in an aerospace company versus something that's not in an aerospace company, but provides you with that engineering challenge is probably more valuable. So maybe not get too fixated on the organization itself, but the work that you're doing, I think, is more important. And having a rocket background is obviously very useful. Goes without saying, but it does not have to be the only way to get into a launch vehicle or a launch business. And a lot of us at Rocket Lab didn't come in from previous experiences on launch vehicles or anything similar. And in many ways that allowed us to innovate a little more freely without any predetermined biases or ways of thinking. So yeah, really what I could maybe summarize it as one is work on complex, challenging problems and conquer them. And that experience is worth a lot.
All right, we might be asking the same question over and over, but this is like the one that we always ask every guest. So if you don't have anything else, that's understandable because you've kind of already hit it out of the park. But what is the general advice you have for young people who are interested in space? You know, there's everyone that listens to this is really excited about the prospects of the industry over the next decades. I would say years, but probably years and decades. What is what's got you excited, and what is your just general advice to young people?
Yeah, good question. I think when I think about space as a whole or as a domain, it's big, it's massive, right? Space is big. I guess that's a tagline in itself.
Hmm.
But I think with that comes in the opportunities that lie within space in this domain. I think the opportunities and the value streams in space we're yet to fully even realize. Every year that goes by, we're doing more things on orbit. We're doing more things going to distant planets. We're seeing technologies like Starship and things that I probably didn't even imagine I'd be seeing just a few years ago in sort of coming to fruition. So I think as space sort of grows, there's going to be a lot of opportunities, and I think having an open mind to what these opportunities are is going to be quite important. Um, and as we open access and as our platforms on orbit and beyond become more and more capable, the science we'll be doing is going to be more and more interesting, and also in many ways we're yet to there's a lot of you don't know what you don't know in this domain. And I think anyone in this industry should have that open mind to look at all the opportunities from all angles, really. They're the obvious things with rockets and spacecraft, but there's a lot more to that as well, with the various communication satellites coming up, the various optics, the synthetic radars. There's just so much new stuff happening in this domain that it's just hard to be to sit still and just focus on some of the more obvious things. So I think having an open mind to look at where you can contribute in this domain is going to be key. It's never going to be obvious at first as well. And I think I'd just say to stay hungry and not stop learning is going to be fundamentally the best advice I could pass on in an area that's constantly growing and expanding as the rate it is right now.
Awesome. So, a couple things to wrap up then. First, is there anything we didn't talk about that you wanted to talk about? Is there anything we missed? I think we
No,
got a
thank
pretty
you. Got a pretty good set
yeah,
of questions there.
sweet. And then one of the last things is, do you have either personal social media channels where you do space stuff, or just Rocket Lab's general social media so people know where they can find you and follow the company as well?
Yeah, I don't personally. I probably don't do a great job at social media. I am on LinkedIn. I use that every now and then to post stuff, so people can feel free to reach out there and exchange ideas and collaborate. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. And then follow Rocket Lab on Twitter. We're constantly tweeting about what's going on in our news. I guess it's a great news outlet for what it is we do. And that would be probably it. That'd be the best ways.
Yeah. And if you haven't seen it yet, go on YouTube, get a chance to watch Peter Beck eat his own hat in the fairing cover, which is pretty funny. So I think we'll probably close it up with that. Thank you, Shaun, for joining us. Thank you, Chad, for co-hosting. On behalf of everyone at Sedscast, thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time.